Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just before I start, just a quick request to someone. Can I have a glass of water, please? Okay, thanks. First of all, my thanks to ICD for the invitation. Thank you to come here today. My topic is quite wide-ranging, so I'll be going quite quickly over several different topics. There'll be questions and answers after, but if there's not much time, feel free to approach me this afternoon, as I'll be loitering here for the rest of today. So the topic is nation branding, cultural diplomacy, and economic objectives, with some just brief examples of what some countries are doing, including South Korea, Japan, China, and France. I'm actually not in, quite luckily, I'm not in Japan anymore. I've moved to the Netherlands in January, and I'm now at Breda, which is a beautiful historic city in the south of the Netherlands. What I'll be covering is mainly based on my book, Nation Branding, which was published 2 or 3 years ago. So what is nation branding? We could spend all day just talking about one topic, but just very briefly, two perspectives. One from a European academic who states that the unbranded state has a difficult time attracting economic and political attention. This is the basic problem for most countries in the world. The problem is not that they have a bad image, they just have little or no image amongst external audiences. A more kind of proactive conceptualization is by Jorgi Zondi, who's a Hungarian scholar and former PR consultant. And he introduces the notion that it's strategic. It's not just a one-off campaign. It needs to be ongoing. And it's not just economic, it's also political and social interest promotion. Now, to start off, the first example I'll give is Korea, South Korea, that is, and the concept of nation brand architecture. So what is nation brand architecture? It's basically the way that different elements of the brand relate to each other. This basically includes the nation itself, which would be seen in the corporate world as the umbrella brand or the corporate brand, the overarching brand. You then have a number of sub-brands, which in the case of countries could include the capital city and other cities and regions. But it could also include the tourism brand, the FDI brand, the public diplomacy brands, the export brand, and so on. So instantly it becomes quite a complicated undertaking. Now, to give you an example of what South Korea is doing, the many elements of their nation branding are culturally rooted and could be defined as cultural diplomacy. But before going on, just as a kind of incidental comment about this institute and its name, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, I attended a conference last week in Los Angeles, at which one panel consisted of the directors of 3 cultural institutes in the west coast of America, the British Council, the Goethe Institute, and the Italian Cultural Institute. And the director of the British Council for the west coast of the US was saying that he and his organisation, British Council, actually rejects the term cultural diplomacy. They much prefer the term cultural relations because the term cultural diplomacy implies government to people. The idea that diplomats can only be government-trained professionals, whereas the British Council sees himself as a people-to-people organisation. But again, that will be a topic for a whole separate conference. But in the case of Korea, many of these initiatives are cultural diplomacy or cultural relations, whichever term you prefer. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just pick out some of the most relevant from a cultural perspective. Promoting Taekwondo. I think this is a very good move because there's always the possibility that external audiences, particularly American and European, will mistake the country of origin of Taekwondo. If you look at the corporate world, there's been research done amongst American students, a group of American students were asked which country they think Nokia, what country that brand is from. and about 85% of students believed it's a Japanese brand. And so if Nokia is a well-known brand, so if there's that level of mistaken identity for such a well-known corporate brand, I would think there's probably similar potential for misunderstanding of Taekwondo as being possibly Japanese, Chinese, just some vague Asian origin rather than specifically Korean. Some other issues, initiatives that the Koreans have undertaken. The Korean Wave program is an attempt to export Korean culture abroad, which has been very successful within other Asian countries and parts of the US, less successful elsewhere. Increasing external aid, that's not really a cultural initiative, but as a humanitarian gesture and an activity, obviously that's a good and positive step to take. Promotion of culture and tourism industries, South Korea has been very active in that respect. And just down the bottom there, one very interesting item, and quite unexpected really, in terms of nation branding, is a desire or an intention to treat foreigners and multicultural families better. Now, you might think, well, what's the relevance of that to nation branding, treating multicultural families better? The relevance is that there are thousands of such people living in South Korea, and many of them feel, rightly or wrongly, that there is quite a high level of prejudice and sometimes racist attitudes against them. And the Korean government is aware of this perception or reality and has decided to actually try and do something about it. Although, as Hua was saying in the previous talk, it's very, very difficult to change the behavior of your country's people. Very difficult thing to do. But I think by stating that as an intention, it kind of sets a good direction for people to at least aim at. Now, in terms of brand architecture and the South Korean nation brand, one question, again to Hua, was should there be one brand for, I think it was for tourism and business? I mean, my view on that is it's better to have separate brands. But there are disagreements on this. Other people in place branding will say you've got to have one consistent brand that is the same everywhere all the time, because that's what branding is, say some people. I actually disagree. I think it's not possible to reduce the whole country into one brand. And I think countries should try and develop separate tourism brands, separate foreign direct investment brands, and separate export promotion brand. The challenge then becomes what linkages do you set up? And that's where countries are very, very weak. And almost no country has yet achieved those linkages in any kind of meaningful way. And very few countries have even tried. So that's really an area, one of the many areas in nation branding that countries need to do much better in. One problem, the final point on this slide, is that it's quite unusual to have responsibility clearly allocated to an individual or an organisation to actually manage the brands or the linkages and so on. There's a question from someone from Ghana. Ghana has got a brand Ghana office which has been set up, but it remains to be seen what influence or power that office will have when it's dealing with the politicians who actually make decisions, particularly about funding. Without funding, you can do some things. You can be creative, but unless you are funded long-term, at a reasonable level, that really limits what you can achieve. Now, moving on to Japan, and one way in which Japan is trying to use cultural diplomacy, and this is a government-funded publication. I don't know how many of you have read anything by Haruki Murakami. He's a great Japanese writer, considered to be the greatest living Japanese author by many people. He very nearly won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the most recent one. He didn't get it, but he'll probably get it in the next few years, the prize. This book is interesting. It's called The Wild Haruki Chase. I think it's a terrible title for what is actually a very good book. And it's a collection of articles by both Japanese and foreign cultural commentators and fans of Murakami, And the book is funded and published by the Japan Foundation. So it was not left to the private sector to do this. It was a public sector, state-funded initiative. And Murakami is very much a symbol of cosmopolitan Japan. He's very Americanized. And in fact, he gets some criticism within Japan for not writing in real Japanese, because his style of Japanese is heavily influenced by American. So that's one initiative that I think is a good one, although I don't think that the Japanese authorities have supported it enough, which is a common case, unfortunately. A completely missed opportunity, which happened for a period of 3 years, until a couple of years ago. If you are a football fan, okay, I'm back in Europe now, not the US, so I can use the word football, and we'll probably agree that that means the game where you kick and score goals, rather than catch the ball and have fights. Now, Shunsuke Nakamura, if you're a football fan, you'll know him. He's known as the Japanese David Beckham, which is accurate in so much as he is the superstar of Japanese football. Personality-wise, nothing in common at all. He's a kind of quiet living, well-behaved, kind of model, kind of son-in-law kind of person. But the point here is he played for a British team, a Scottish team, Glasgow Celtic, for 3 seasons. During that time, he was voted Player of the Year once. He scored the winning goal for Celtic against Manchester United in a European Cup game. And in terms of football, it doesn't come much bigger than that, apart from winning the World Cup. But even with all of that achievement and presence, the Japanese authorities did nothing to capitalise on this as an opportunity to build Japan's profile, reputation, brand, whatever you like to call it, within the UK and Europe. So the point is, you need to be entrepreneurial. You need to be able to take these opportunities when they're there, because they don't last. In sports, he was there for 3 seasons, then he moved on, as everyone knew he would. So you need to be able to act quickly. And in general, foreign ministries and cultural institutes, to a lesser extent, are not famous for their quick reactions or proactive approach to life. So key challenges for Brand Japan. Okay, obviously I'm just talking about the brand just now. Obviously there's more important things going on in Japan right now. But in terms of branding Japan, Japan's got very positive perceptions in terms of exports, driven by basic cars and electronics. So Sony, Toyota, great corporate mega brands that certainly have improved the image of Japan. However, I think the country could invest more in cultural diplomacy. At the moment, all the focus from the state in Japan is basically the kind of Hello Kitty, cute, kawaii, it's called in Japanese, this kind of cutie kind of approach, and manga, which is supported by the government, but not much else. Okay? There's been 1 or 2 half-hearted food and drink campaigns, but nothing really sustained or good. So this doesn't just apply to Japan, though. In general, a more entrepreneurial spirit within nation branding would be a good thing. But in reality, that's difficult, because what you always come up against is politicians who either don't understand branding or who are actively against the concept of branding. As Hwao said in his talk, many people are quite hostile to the whole notion of place branding. And you also have foreign ministries who tend to be very, very conservative and hostile even to the notion of public diplomacy, never mind nation branding. So it's a challenge. I actually received an email from a diplomat from one of the Asian embassies in Washington, D.C., who contacted me. I'd met him before, and he contacted me to say that he had suggested to his embassy in D.C. that they start doing some nation branding and to promote the country's image within the U.S., and he told me he'd been cold-shouldered by his colleagues, so they stopped talking to him, they treated him as if he was some kind of lunatic, and just a completely negative reaction to just the suggestion that the country could actually start promoting itself. So there are very strong conservative mindsets that are set against place branding and public diplomacy in some countries. Now, ideally, you would have everyone included in nation branding. I do think the public sector should take the lead, although that's a political opinion, and you might differ. But I think government is the only institution that can claim at all really to speak on behalf of the people. You then have public sector organisations such as national tourism organisations, trade promotion agencies. You then have the private sector, trade associations. PSC is just product, service and corporate, basically commercial brands. And then you have citizens, which is the least manageable, but possibly high impact, also high impact elements. Now, and one important aspect of citizens is the diaspora, which some countries have been very active in engaging with. Other countries have pretty much ignored their diaspora. And there are very political and historical reasons for that difference in approach. It's a challenge engaging with the diaspora being people from a certain country who have chosen to, for whatever reason, to emigrate and live abroad and start a new life somewhere. One problem with engaging with the diaspora is the diaspora, like the consumers that Huao mentioned, diaspora is not one homogeneous mass. They're not all the same. So if you look at any diaspora, the Greek diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, the fact that they are diaspora gives them one thing in common, but maybe not much more than that. So it can be a challenge, and if the diaspora is big, they tend to divide themselves into associations and clubs and societies, and very often they actually ignore or are actually quite hostile to each other. For example, if a country has got two or more religions, that will be a natural kind of fault line that will immediately spring up in the foreign country. I actually raised this topic with someone at the Embassy of Poland in Tokyo, and just asked them, well, why is the Polish government not really engaging with this diaspora? And the reply was, well, we don't try to do that because it would be impossible. And he used this phrase, which apparently they have in Polish, if you have two Polish people, you have three opinions. Which is a kind of variation on what the Greeks say, is that a Greek can start an argument in an empty room. So how would you get these people to kind of come together? It's a challenge, but governments they need to reflect. Is it worth it? Maybe it is worth taking up that challenge. The private sector ideally should participate in any nation branding activity. The reason I mentioned Spain here, this is quite an unusual example because in Spain the private sector has actually taken the lead, at least for some of Spain's nation branding. So many of almost all of the top brands in Spain are members of what's called the Leading Brands of Spain Forum. And this forum has got two aims. One is to improve the commercial success of Spanish corporate brands globally. And the second, simultaneous aim, is to improve the image of brand Spain as a country. So it's quite unusual to see the private sector willingly and voluntarily taking such an initiative. The reason they did that is that Spain's tourism brand is very strong, its export brand is not. So that was the driving force behind it. Now, moving to a different part of the world, China's nation branding. This is obviously a huge issue because China, obviously the challenge for China is not the fact that people don't know anything about it. It's people are fed constantly information and comments about China. Now, so there's a lot of sensitivity within China about how the country is perceived. And to such an extent that the Chinese government was aware that its Asian neighbours were getting very worried about the economic rise of China, and China becoming more powerful than it has been in the past. So there was a kind of slogan that China used called China's Peaceful Rise. And the word peaceful was inserted to try and reassure the neighbors, particularly Japan, South Korea, that China was not threatening. It was becoming richer, more powerful, but it was not looking to militarily expand anywhere. So peaceful was put in there, which is quite unusual for nation branding, to put in the word peaceful. But even that wasn't enough. The word rise was perceived to be threatening. So they actually changed it to China's Peaceful Development, which is inoffensive, but probably the most boring slogan any country could create. So that has led to China putting a lot of effort into cultural diplomacy, probably more effort than any other country in the world. So China has certainly embraced public diplomacy and soft power. Now, just a brief definition of public diplomacy. One of the main academics in this area is Jan Melissen in the Netherlands. And I think it's a good definition. It's short and to the point. What is public diplomacy? It's the relationship between diplomats and the foreign publics with whom they work. Now, that's different from traditional diplomacy, because traditional diplomacy is where diplomats talk to diplomats from other countries, and they also talk to politicians from the host government, and completely ignore the domestic population. And many diplomats prefer it that way. They don't want to be kind of dragged into a kind of public popularity contest. But China and the United States is the other nation that invests very, very heavily in public diplomacy. These superpowers, they see a need for this. Another view of public diplomacy, and again, this is very much taking the view that it's not just about communications, advertising, and so on. It's about what you do. So money, soldiers, aid workers. So we can see that right now in the case of the earthquake in Japan. Already, many countries have mobilized to actually help. And you need to do research to confirm it, but probably that's going to have more impact on the way certainly the Japanese people perceive those countries than an advertising campaign. Okay? Did they help us when we needed it? Now, China's public diplomacy, it uses various elements, the media, internet, events and projects, celebrities, publications. That's a basic checklist that any country could use. But in the case of China, it's very, very difficult. It's so high profile, it's so huge, it's so diverse culturally. How can they actually try and project anything that is coherent? Now, I'm going to present here just some brief findings from a study I did in Tokyo in 2008. And this involved, I conducted one interview at the Chinese embassy in Tokyo, and then some interviews with experts, kind of journalists, diplomats, an NHK news producer, and so on, about what China's doing. Now, the view from the Chinese embassy, so this is what the embassy told me they're doing, and it's a very strategic set of actions. Very active communication with the Japanese Press Association, regular conferences, explanations of policy, changes of policy by the Chinese Communist Party. So that was done out of a desire to kind of frame the discourse, rather than just leaving the Japanese media to report what China's doing, trying to get the Chinese point of view across. Internet, this was quite an early stage, so the websites were pretty crude at the time, but they were going to do more work on that. Celebrities, there is a kind of sub-sector of public diplomacy called celebrity diplomacy, which is the use of celebrities to create goodwill between countries. So China's involved in this. Tokyo Movie Week is regularly visited by Chinese film stars who are well received by Japanese fans. So it's all a way to try and overcome the animosity and bad feeling that historically has existed between Japan and China. is to try and overcome that, and the best way to overcome that is by people meeting other people. Just advertising is not going to change anything in that respect. So specific events and projects that the Chinese do: Chinese National Day, huge events between 1,000 and 2,000 people, very kind of high-powered networking day. Publications, China Book International. That's state-funded, and I often wonder if anyone actually reads it. I was given a copy when I visited the embassy. I had a quick flick through it, but other embassies do this as well. If you go to embassies, you often come away with a very heavy bag of publications, beautifully printed and published, but you really wonder who is the audience for this. And I suspect there is no audience. It's just a box they tick. Yes, we've done our publications this year. However, a completely different thing is support for translation of literature. And I think that's a very good thing that countries should do more of. Germany has actually been quite active in this. And again, this is kind of categorized as book diplomacy, where funds are made available by the state to translate works of German literature into English and other languages. And the Chinese do a similar thing. And I think that's a very good thing. You may have experienced this yourself. Very often if you read a novel or poetry or whatever by a foreign writer, that stimulates your interest, not just in that writer, but in the country that they come from. And ultimately might lead you to actually want to visit there, even live there, or buy something from that country. And even if none of those consequences happened, I think it's still a good thing to do. It increases mutual understanding and appreciation of other people's cultures. Now, the big thing, though, for China has been their setting up of Confucius Institutes, of which there are 10. I think there's actually 2 or 3 more now in Japan. I think it's interesting, the naming of all of these cultural institutes for all countries. So it's not the China Institute, because probably that would attract all the kind of Western media criticism that Chinese government attracts. Whereas Confucius, you can't really attack Confucius. Cultural figure that people in the West don't really know much about, just it's a symbol of wisdom and historical authenticity. So I think that's probably a good move. But again, it's kind of another topic, but other countries, they've got that same decision to make. What should they call their cultural institutes? And again, the conference I was at last week, the director of the British Council, West Coast of the US, he led a campaign within the council 10 years ago to try and get the British Council to change its name from British Council to Creative UK. Because the word council sounds very bureaucratic and administrative and dull. And what the British Council are trying to project is this image of the UK as a dynamic, creative country. So the name kind of contradicts, or at least doesn't help, the mission of the organisation. But anyway, the Confucius Institutes that they've been set up, despite the hostility and bad feeling that often exists between China and Japan, the cultural connections are deep. The Japanese language evolved from Chinese. I mean, culturally there are connections. A regular program of cultural performances, between 50 and 100. Probably the only country that provides as much cultural performances within Japan is Italy, who are extremely supportive of their country's culture. Very, very active, well over 100 events per year in Japan by the Italians. Exchanges are encouraged between Chinese and Japanese. Schools, universities, chambers of commerce, twin cities. Obviously, that's a good thing, although it is potentially can be the victim of politics, as happened a few months ago when there was a fishing trawler incident not far from Okinawan Islands, where a Chinese fishing boat went into Japanese waters, or waters that are claimed by Japan. The Japanese Navy arrested the crew, and there was a big diplomatic incident. At exactly the same time as hundreds of Japanese school kids were meant to go to the Shanghai Expo. and that visit was cancelled by the Chinese. Didn't let them in, which is obviously unfortunate, but I think still it's just a risk you have to take, that these initiatives are not always going to go ahead successfully, but that doesn't mean you should give up on them. Now, the research I did, this was amongst one former ambassador, one news producer from NHK, which is the Japanese version of BBC, the state broadcaster, one or two academics, and some kind of cultural commentators. This was asking their opinion on how successful China's efforts had been within Japan. So the first question was, how successful has China been over the past 5-10 years in building a positive reputation within Japan? And the answers were not very positive. Now, the first answer there, I don't know if anyone's familiar with what became called the gyoza incident. Is anyone? No? Gyoza is the Japanese word for dumpling, okay, the food. And what happened in, I think it's February 2008, some dumplings imported from China into Japan were poisoned, and several Japanese people fell quite seriously ill. No one died, but one or two people were kind of on the edge for a while. Now, this blew up into a huge diplomatic political incident between China and Japan, for the obvious reason that these poisoned dumplings were imported from China into Japan. And so there were huge police investigations into where these dumplings were poisoned. Were they poisoned in China before they were exported, or was it within Japan? And turns out it was within China. So this, obviously, the Japanese media kind of picked up on this, and it caused a lot of anti-Chinese feeling. And the embassy did react, I think, quite well to this challenge. I was actually scheduled to meet the diplomat at the Chinese embassy on the very day that the story broke. So our meeting had to be postponed a few hours because they had an emergency session. How are we going to deal with this PR disaster? And it caused a lot of bad feeling. And sales of Chinese food products dropped to almost zero and didn't pick up for probably 2 or 3 months after that incident. Anti-Japanese riots a few years ago within China, the stance on Taiwan. So lots of things conspiring to create a bad relationship. Now, in terms of a question, what activities, what tools does China use within Japan to promote its national reputation? I asked the respondents what were they aware of, what had they seen. And bear in mind that these are people, journalists, diplomats, a news producer from NHK, and this was a common response. There just seemed to be almost no impact by China's public diplomacy activities. So maybe a small impact. That was about as positive a response as they got. Now, the key challenges facing China in its attempts to build a positive reputation within Japan: media relations, public opinions. Media policy in general was seen to be not very skillful by either side. On the side of the Chinese, it was seen as being kind of crude and bullying. On the side of the Japanese, it was seen as being just refusing to talk to the foreign media. So in different ways, the media strategies of the two nations was seen to be pretty negative. But amongst the people, I think this is the main bone of contention. And this is fear in Japan of China getting bigger and Japan smaller. And as this respondent said, it's hard for China to deal with this. What can China do? It can say it's a peaceful rise, but obviously it wants its economy to keep growing. It's going to become stronger. But it definitely seems to be true that within Japan that there is this fear that Japan. There's this phrase Japan passing, this notion that the world is passing Japan by. And so Japan's status, it used to be the second biggest economy in the world, it's now third. I still think that's a great achievement for Japan to be third. It's a great achievement, but because they've been used to so long for being second, psychologically it's quite a shock to now be third. A specific question, what effects do you think the establishment of the Confucius Institutes has had on China's reputation? Same thing, none that I'm aware of. And this person, who's highly educated, he writes a column for a Japanese newspaper, never heard of Confucius Institutes in Japan. Now, you can say, well, that's that person's fault for being ignorant. You should be better informed. But it's true. It's very, very low profile. I think one reason it's low profile is that, unlike the British Council, and unlike some other culture institutes, the Confucius Institutes do not have, well, certainly not in Japan or in most places, they do not have their own building. The strategy of the Chinese government is you house the Confucius Institute within, usually, a university in the host country. So instantly, that reduces the profile and impact because you're not a standalone place. You're just like an annex or an add-on to some other much better established institution. Another thing about Confucius, because as I said earlier, I think it's a good name for this institute because it's almost impossible to attack it. But the drawback is, as this respondent says, people know the name, they know about him, but quite peripheral. It doesn't really have any meaning for your day-to-day life. The media coverage, this was early 2008, before the Olympics took place. So this was asking the effect on China's reputation. And it tended to be mixed. The fact that China was getting so much coverage was obviously good in terms of profile, but certainly in the European and American media, the coverage was very negative. And it reached a height with the Olympic torch when it was taken through the streets of London and Paris. There was a lot of trouble. In Paris, you may remember, the torch was actually grabbed out of the hand of a Chinese person who was holding it, and that Chinese person was in a wheelchair. And that caused, obviously, a huge diplomatic row between China and France, which the French did. The French embassy was working overtime in Beijing to deal with that for weeks afterwards. Okay, so that's a kind of cultural approach to achieving certain aims in terms of perceptions of your country. A completely different approach, and this is back here in Europe, taken by the French. Obviously, the French Institute is very active worldwide, and there's a very strong sense of mission in projecting French culture and civilization. But that is fairly well established. That's people look up to and admire French culture. That's pretty much a given. What is not so admired is France's economic scene, particularly by foreign investors from some countries. Now, the New France was a campaign that was launched as a nation-branding activity by France. But this was not run as a cultural campaign. It was run by the Invest in France agency. So this had very clear economic objectives. So more kind of tangible rather than the intangible cultural routes that other countries have taken. Now, what France has done or tried to do is reinvent itself as an economy to become an easier place to do business if you're a foreign company. Business formalities have been simplified. You might think that's just a small detail, but it's not, because particularly if you are a small or medium-sized company and you want to do business, whether it's just simple exporting or set up an office or some kind of presence in a foreign country, if it takes months and months to get the necessary registrations and certification, then what companies will do, they'll just go somewhere else where it's easier. Now, for many developing countries, this is a major problem that absolutely cannot be solved by slogans, logos, or advertising. So this is something that the French realized needed to be done to reduce the time that it takes. In fact, just this morning on CNN International, there was adverts for it was Macedonia, and one point that the person was making in that advert was a claim that it only takes 4 hours to fill in all the forms you need to do business there. find that hard to believe, but that's a claim they're making, because they've obviously realised, that is an important point for potential investors. The infrastructure and talented workforce, that's in place. And so certainly the transport infrastructure is very good in France. However, there was perceived to be a gap in perceptions. They did quite a lot of research to base this on. And what they found was that perceptions of France as an economy were pretty positive in China and Japan. However, that was not the case at all in the USA and the UK. So I was quite surprised to hear that Chinese and Japanese companies have got a positive perception of France as a place to do business, because it's certainly true within the UK and the US, France has got a pretty bad reputation. That might be unfair or undeserved, but it's certainly the reputation that the British and American media project of France as kind of the land of strikes. But that image doesn't seem to have reached or to be prevalent in China or Japan. So that was the kind of identity image gap that the French perceived needed to be remedied. So changing the world's opinion, although more accurately that is changing the opinion of investors in the USA and the UK and other Western countries. And it was the IFA, so this had a clear economic mandate. This is not just about spreading goodwill between nations, this is about helping the French economy. But they did create a slogan, the new France where the smart money goes. And this was part of an image campaign. One good aspect of the campaign is it was collaborative. It did try to be inclusive. And it was funded a reasonable amount. It was developed and run by IFA, which is a good thing, because it meant that the economic objective was always very clearly top of mind. But it included UBI France, various other French organisations, including tourism, but a very minor role. Now, the campaign goals, and again, this is often something that is lacking in nation branding campaigns, that there are no goals. The country just produces an advert, shows it on CNN for 2 months, and then forgets about everything. But this wasn't like that. They had clear goals. And it was to try and change opinions. Obviously, attracting investments, real concrete investment was an objective as well. But a prelude to that was to change perceptions. And one way in which they did this was through the use of testimonials. So positive comments from senior executives, quite often chief executives, of foreign companies who've gone to France and who, at least publicly, say they're happy with their experience there. So this was to build credibility, because if you've got someone who's perceived to be a neutral, a foreign neutral, particularly a neutral foreign expert, then that carries much more weight than just an advert claiming that France is a great place to do business. So some of the aspects that they emphasised: flexible labour laws. Yep. Okay. Right, so I'll speak even faster just to finish off. Superior healthcare system. Various real concrete indicators that France is a good place to do business. Now, both me and Huao have kind of downplayed the role of advertising, and certainly advertising is not enough in itself, but I think it can play at least a supporting role in communicating what a country is trying to do. So these adverts, they appeared in the right places, not mass market newspapers, but the newspapers that business people read. The FT, Wall Street Journal, the Nikkei in Japan. Also billboard ads at major airports. Videos, a book available in 5 languages. These kind of supporting things that, again, I have my doubts how effective they are, but they were available if people wanted them. But here we come to the most important point, face-to-face contacts. So yes, there was advertising, there was a website, but the most important thing was senior IFA executives plus French business people went on basically a global tour, meeting literally thousands of potential investors all over the world persuading them to come to France. And the people at IFA in Tokyo, who I interviewed, were very insistent that this was much more important than the advertising. And in fact, they didn't want to spend money on advertising. They wanted all the money to go into this. Face-to-face, conferences, networking, and so on. And it seemed to work. According to their figures, there was a big shift in perceptions. And also this kind of grand claim that 40,000 new jobs were created in 2006, a 33% increase over 2005. Now, of course, you would have to examine that quite rigorously and see, well, what else was going on. Currency exchange rates can have an impact as well. But certainly, that is a big move in the right direction. So in summary, just to kind of wrap up, different approaches according to different countries. Japan, more kind of nation branding, focus on innovation and design and protection of culture. China, not so much kind of business-led, although that will change in the coming years, but much more culturally focused, public diplomacy. South Korea, as far as I'm concerned, that they are the most energized and about nation branding right now. There's a Korean Presidential Council on Nation Branding that's been in existence for 2-3 years. So they've got a real enthusiasm for building that up. And France, no kind of overall nation branding, but a quite effective specific economic investments branding campaign. Okay, and I know it's time for lunch, so I'd better finish now before I get crushed in the stampede. Thank you.